What's up, outliers? Welcome to another performance bite or bite-sized insights into complex subjects in health and performance. Today, we're going to break down different types of periodization. So, if you're not familiar with what periodization is, it simply means how to create training programs. And the big thing that I always kind of come across when I talk to people about this is there is a difference between training and working out. Training means there's a plan in place, there's a goal, there's an objective that we're working towards, and we have basically step A to B to C to D all the way through, and we know how that's going to actually look compared to what I call working out, where you go to the gym and you just kind of piece things together, which, don't get me wrong, is better than nothing. However, to actually elicit adaptation in the body, we need periodization to help basically create a stimulus for change to occur. So if we're not overloading at the right times and unloading at the right times, we're not going to allow the body to basically get stress that is hormetically put on it to create that change, because the body is a creature of habit, and it's also a creature that likes to do the least amount of work possible. So periodization kind of helps us manufacture work over time, and we can see long-term what that is actually going to look like compared to if we're just showing up at the gym, and we're going, well, like that machine's open, or the dumbbell rack with, the bench in front of it, I'm going to go sit in front of that and do some dumbbell stuff. Like I said, better than nothing. However, if your objective is to get yourself better, get yourself to, whatever your goal is, or, your point, then having a periodized program is definitely going to be the way to go, which is why I always make sure to follow all of these different types of periodization when creating my programs, which is super important because I want to help people actually achieve their goals and get them where they're going. So, whether somebody is on a custom program, totally customized, or they're on, a pre-made program, there's a periodization that is in place to develop somebody over time. And usually using stuff like progressive overload, which is the first thing kind of that goes into periodization. Progressive overload is essentially a method of adding more stress week to week to make sure the body is actually creating that change. Now, when we do that, we have to be careful, because if we just overload to infinity, say you're doing a bench press, you start at 45 pounds, which is the bar. Next week, you go to 50, 55, 60, 65, so forth, so forth, so forth. Eventually, you're going to reach a mark where you just can't do any more, so that's not wonderful. And also, probably by week 5, 6, 7, you're going to be pretty burnt out and tired of doing the same shit over and over and over again without having change of repetition, without having change of intensity, volume, and stuff like that. And that's really what the periodization is. So progressive overload is using that method of overloading over the weeks, but it also brings in a deload week, every 5 or 6 weeks, sometimes every 4 weeks, depending upon the magnitude of the program. So, if somebody is new to training, deload weeks usually aren't fully necessary until somebody is working pretty hard, the volume's getting really big, or the intensity is coming up and stuff like that. And to be clear, I'm saying volume is basically the total weight moved, which would be reps times sets. Meanwhile, reps times sets and weight, that creates your volume. Intensity, when I say intensity, I'm talking about the total amount of weight. So the amount of weight that is being used. So that's really important to know, because we will kind of look at what that looks like in the programs. So glad I came back to that. Sorry. So with the progressive overload, however, we're controlling the intensity and the volumes to elicit adaptation. Then deload, we back it off. And when a person is new, they don't get that as much. But as that volume goes up, then we're going to need to increase the deloads a little bit more frequently, essentially. Deloading is when adaptations occur most the time. So you are making adaptations as you build through a program. Early on in a program, typically the adaptations that are occurring are more neuromuscular, because if you're going from nothing to a strength training program, your nervous system is essentially coming online. So each week it's kind of ramping up. Say it starts at 70%. So the next time you do that exercise, it's now at 75, so forth, which is then it's going to actually meet its capacity. And then you're going to see more muscular breakdown from there. And so there's those immediate adaptations neuromuscularly. But when we're breaking down tissue, your body can only withstand so much breakdown before it needs a freaking rest. And that's that deload that will happen, week 4, 5, or 6, depending upon the magnitude of the program. But with that being said, within a program as well, we have different blocks, essentially. And so we break it down in this way. A macro cycle would be like a full year training program. So from January 1st to December 31st, that would be your macro program. Within that, we can break it up a couple smaller. So the meso, which is, can be anywhere from 6 weeks up to 3 months, depending upon individual season, which is also where we kind of see like off season, preseason, in season, postseason. But not all sports are like perfectly divided up into 3 months and stuff like that. So we see kind of more fluctuation of duration in that. But that's what we would call our meso. Meanwhile, when we get into the micro, that could be anywhere from 1 week to 4 weeks, kind of just that smaller block of time where there's a lot more happening at the immediate moment. And we can kind of predict what that's going to look like better than what we can predict 6 months from now is going to look like. But we can at least put in place a method with the periodization of where it should go. Of course, there's going to be adjustments that need to be made along the way. Let's talk about hydration. Now, did you know that you could lose up to 1,000 milligrams of sodium per hour during exercise? So that is 1 gram. That is a lot of sodium. And most of the time, if you're salting your food, that's wonderful and great, but it might not be enough. And if you're not salting your food, it's definitely not enough. That's where Next Hydration comes into play. Next Hydration has 800 milligrams of sodium per serving, but it also has 300 milligrams of potassium, which is really important because when we're sweating, we're not just losing sodium, we're also losing a lot of potassium. So this is formulated to actually match what we lose in our sweat of sodium potassium in ratio. So not only that, it tastes awesome because it's actually a very light flavor, just a little bit of lemon, almost like just drinking some lemon water. So keeping it nice and simple. If you want to try Next Hydration, head over to nexthydration.com, use code OUTLIERATHLETE for 10% off your order. So the first type of periodization, which is the most common type of periodization, and a type that I use quite frequently because it's really great for beginners and also like Gen Pop and athletes in off season. So this is linear periodization, and the name kind of speaks for itself. So as we go through a training program, we're basically increasing intensity and reducing volume as we go. So let's break this down as a year-long type program where we're trying to work throughout the year to create the best possible outcomes for an athlete or just a Gen Pop person. So typically we're going to start with some endurance type rep schemes, which are going to obviously be higher up in low intensity, especially if somebody is new to weight training. We want to give them a lot of practice. So that's where we see things like 12 to 15 reps, where somebody is going to have lots of repetition practice at that movement, say it's a squat. Then once that's kind of been established, maybe that lasts for 6 weeks. Then we build up into hypertrophy, where hypertrophy is where a lot of muscular breakdown occurs. And then that's going to be high volume, low intensity. And when I say low intensity, that of course varies person to person, and the volume is going to vary person to person based upon individual strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that. But that's where we're going to see anywhere from 8 to 12 repetition and roughly about 65 to 75% of a 1 rep max, which at that point, if you're new to training, you don't really know what your 1 rep max is, but there can be estimations that are put into place and can be used to, gain that knowledge essentially. Next would be to move on to the strength training side of things, which hypertrophy could last anywhere from 6 weeks to 12 weeks, just depending upon what that season looks like. And my math's not going to be perfect here, of course. But strength training, moderate volume, moderate intensity. So we're cranking up the intensity. Now we're up towards 80 to 90% of 1 rep max. Meanwhile, our reps are going anywhere from 3 to 6. And that's where a lot of time is going to be spent gaining strength, of course. And depending upon the athlete's season, we might be looking at trying to do that right before we get into like athletic competition. But the next transition over into power would be where we would actually want somebody to be at their max strength and max power right before competition time. So power is the next transition, and that's going to be low volume, which once again, volume is reps times sets times weight. So we got low volume, and then we have high intensity to go with it. And this can look a couple different ways because there's new methods of training where we do like velocity style training where we're actually measuring the rate of bar movement and using less weight. That's a high intensity in itself, but we're not going to be necessarily using a high percentage of our 1 rep max when doing that. However, if we're not doing velocity style training, we can just go up to like 90 to 97% of our 1 rep max and using 1 to 3 reps. That's still considered power because it's kind of all hands on deck when doing that type of training. You activate everything, and if that weight was not there, you would essentially be moving very, very fast. If I have 300 pounds on my back and I squat it, the amount of effort that I'm putting out to get that weight up, if you removed that weight and I put that same amount of effort in, I'd be moving very quickly. So still considered power, but there's still kind of 2 ways about that. And depending upon the individual, it might not be necessary to be doing 1 to 3 reps of a really high intensity, because especially if somebody's new, maybe that's not appropriate for them to really go into that phase and develop that adaptation at the time. So that's what I'm kind of getting at is like with the linear periodization is we look at it from that scope of the macro, the year long. We really kind of break it down into those mesos more so. And we might not really actually hit a power phase. But if it's an athlete training for an athletic competition, power is very necessary. But if you're watching this as somebody that just wants to improve your overall health and fitness and be on a training program, you can do power a few different ways. So if you don't want to get under your 100% max, don't worry. Sponsor of today's episode is intake breathing. Now, intake breathing started with just creating nasal dilators, which I use every single day, whether it's for sleep or for recovery. What a great tool to be able to enhance my nasal breathing. But they also make mouth tape. And if you're not familiar with mouth tape, it is exactly what it sounds like. It is tape that goes over your mouth. That is super helpful for recovery when we're sleeping. It can actually help enhance our nasal breathing, which is going to obviously bring in more oxygen, but also reduce our frequency of breath throughout the night. So when we're breathing 15 times in 1 minute throughout the night, that's going to add up really quick. We can even shave off 1 breath per minute. That's a lot less work that the body has to do and a lot more relaxed the body will be. So if you want to try out their nasal strips or their mouth tape, head over to intakebreathing.com/outlierathlete and use code outlierathlete for 15% off. The next type of periodization is undulating or non-linear periodization. So this essentially is taking everything that we just talked about and doing the opposite. So when we're doing, just hit 100% of my max there. I'm sorry. So when we're doing a non-linear periodization, essentially what we're doing is we're going to manipulate our intensities throughout the weeks, throughout our months, and everything like that. But we're going to kind of be making adaptations to all things hypertrophy, strength, and power at one time. So it might look something of the sort where Monday is a hypertrophy, Wednesday is a strength, Friday is a power. And within that, you're going to develop adaptations to all three of those, but it's going to happen much slower because when we specifically are training for one thing, our body gets really happy and is like, hey, we're going to be really good at this one thing. But when we're dosing in basically a lot of variety, it takes more time for it to pick up what you want from it, which is not a bad thing. It just is if you're trying to get a quicker adaptation for a event or something like that, say it's running a half marathon or something like that, then maybe doing hypertrophy, strength and running at the same time when you only have 1 month to get ready for it probably isn't the best method to create the adaptations that you need. So that would kind of go into the next periodization that we'll talk about. But with the nonlinear, it's really kind of good for more advanced athletes, for one, because they can handle that stress and change in frequency and intensity and volumes more. But also for athletes that tend to have like a longer in-season program. So a good example would be like if the in-season time extends 6 to 8 months of the year and there's not much of an off-season nor preseason, then having a program that kind of gives some of that adaptation of hypertrophy, strength, and power throughout it is going to be more helpful. Now, of course, there's a lot of nuance to that, but it is a good way to kind of have your cake and eat it too, just in a slower fashion. So like I said, it's not going to be as quick of adaptation as like linear periodization or the next one we get to, but it definitely is a good method to kind of just keep a good intensity on all these things. And also it's kind of fun because you get to have set days of like, hey, I'm going to really be breaking down more tissue today, or, I'm going to really work my nervous system down with strength, or I'm going to have a lot more fun because I'm going to be moving quick, or I'm going to be lifting really heavy. So kind of nice to have that change up sometimes and just keeps things fresh as well. So the next form of periodization is block periodization. So block periodization kind of speaks for itself. It breaks stuff into blocks. And the best way of thinking about this is you can either cycle it throughout, say, a mesocycle of 4 months where you're doing 4 different adaptations, call it endurance, hypertrophy, strength, and power, but each month is dedicated specifically to each one of those. And it kind of helps you build into the next one. But your blocks also could look like 3-month times where you're doing 3 months of endurance, 3 months of hypertrophy, 3 months of strength, 3 months of power. It really just kind of depends on, what you want out of it, of course, and also what a coach or trainer designs for the athlete in the sport. So some sports that's going to be fairly necessary, call it a strength sport of like powerlifting or weightlifting, stuff like that. That's a lot more appropriate, especially if power is being done at the right time and strength is being done at the right time for competitions and things like that. But if you have an athlete that, say, is doing a lot of competition throughout 8 months, like I was talking about in the nonlinear program or nonlinear periodization, you would kind of run into some issues because that athlete would create really good adaptation at that moment, specifically to hypertrophy or specifically to strength, which depending upon the sport could be really beneficial for one thing, but also not very good for another thing. So time and place in sport is really important when determining what type of periodization is being done. If you're not an athlete and you're not competing in any sports and you're just somebody that wants to gain fitness, gain strength, and be on a program, then this is a totally fine way to do periodization. Also keeps things fairly simple because you just know like, hey, for the next month or 2 or 3, I'm just focusing on this thing. Then I'm going to let that transfer to the next thing and let that transfer to the next thing and so forth. There is method in the madness when we do talk about like the endurance to the hypertrophy to the strength to the power. We don't want to start this system with power and then go to endurance and then the strength and then the hypertrophy. These systems that are in place are actually tending to our physiology and how the body adapts well. You can definitely set yourself up for an injury much easier when you try and manipulate those things. Think that the rule doesn't apply to you and your body and stuff like that. So I will say, like, use, your best discretion and be like, hey, this is how things are. So this is how I'm going to do. Now, if you're not really an endurance athlete, maybe you eliminate that block and you just do a hypertrophy, strength and power, something like that. But if you're just trying to be all well-rounded and, have a good program that you're going into the gym with, then there's no harm to that whatsoever. I will say it's definitely more so for advanced athletes and people that can withstand longer months of, the same shit over and over again. So do keep that in mind, because like in the hypertrophy, the high volume, to be able to withstand high volume and adapt and recover and stuff like that is fairly challenging. So if you're not very well equipped to be able to do that, this might not be the best way of doing it, which kind of jumps back to the linear periodization, which is similar in a way because the block periodization is one block at a time. Linear periodization actually starts to blend these together into like sports seasons, which is like I was talking about, like the block periodization might not be great for some sports, but when we use linear periodization, it does have like a specific, hey, we're going to adapt to a hypertrophy, we're going to adapt to strength, adapt to power. But we're lining that up into more of those micro phases rather than like longer, big meso phases. So those adaptations come at shorter times because typically that's going to allow somebody to have, the off season to the preseason to the end season and stuff like that, which is really important for sports performance. So last one is conjugate or congruent, interchangeable words there, periodization. So this essentially is training for every adaptation at once. And that is similar to the nonlinear. However, there's not going to be any sort of meso or micro phases. It's just basically you're just training everything at once for duration of whatever. Very popular in powerlifting because you can just hit volume. Like powerlifting is all about how much you can lift in your 3 big lifts. So if that's your sport and your goal is to just lift heavy, it doesn't serve huge purpose to go into hypertrophy. And if you do, you're doing it for shorter stints or you're tossing it in here and there, but mostly you're working on strength and big lifts because you want your body to adapt to those big lifts. You're definitely not doing endurance type lifts. So yeah, it's, like I said, kind of similar to the nonlinear. And when it really comes back to it, if you can understand linear and nonlinear periodization, then you have a pretty good grasp upon what you can do with your training as far as building yourself up with that progressive overload for 4 to 6 weeks with 1 week of deload, doing that for 2 to 3 months, then taking a full month of deload, so forth, so forth. So we really can get really far when you start to have a game plan. And like I said in the beginning of this, when you're just going into the gym and working out, it is better than nothing. However, I would highly recommend checking out my programs, checking out another coach's program that is going to have sound periodization, because the periodization is going to ultimately help you get where you want to go, because you're actually going to make adaptations for change. We're going to make sure that you don't develop overtraining syndromes and stuff like that, because that is a thing, and that is a nasty thing where you're going to basically hit plateaus and you're going to try and push through them, and then you're going to start to feel even worse because you're doing that. So periodization is set up to eliminate that and make sure that doesn't happen by using specific intensities, using specific time and duration of, certain adaptation of programs and stuff like that. So it's a lot of information, and, maybe it just needs to be simple as, making sure that you're building up and resting and recovering. But for athletes that really want to get the most out of their training, or even just general people that want to get the most out of training, periodization is the way to go. And, it's a really good method to make sure that you get what you want, essentially, because you're already going and you're putting in the work. So let's make sure that that work is actually going towards what you want. So a lot of information, but super good information that I think is really helpful for myself to understand, of course, as a coach, but also anyone listening to this or watching this. It's good for you to understand, because then you can kind of sniff out if somebody that you're working with, be it a trainer or coach, is just feeding you workouts. And honestly, that's kind of a waste of your money at the end of the day if you're just being fed workouts, because you're likely paying them to help you get where you want to go, and simply just doing hodgepodge shit probably isn't going to get you there. So that's my rant to add on to that. So thanks so much for watching or listening, and please like, subscribe, comment. If you have any questions, please comment them. I'd be more than happy to answer any of them. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.